The morning of the auction began as any other Wednesday might in Flaxborough, with the market square gradually filling with its accustomed medley of gardeners, housewives and the odd gentleman with more leisure than discernment. A faint mist clung to the cobbles, lending a mild theatricality to the stately Georgian facades, though no one remarked upon it. By 9 o'clock, the town's principal auctioneer, Mr. Pembroke, was arranging his small wooden dais in the front hall of the Flaxborough Town Hall, beneath a portrait of a beneficent former mayor whose eyes seemed to follow every footstep with a combination of judgment and faint boredom. The object of interest for this particular morning was the old Creighton house, long empty and reputedly unloved. The property had a certain dignity, although that dignity leaned toward melancholy. Its windows, streaked with the residue of a century of drizzle, seemed almost to sigh when one passed. A few sparrows had taken up residence, preening with the composure of aristocrats, and the garden had gone wild in an elegant, if unmanaged, chaos of rose, bramble, and stubbornly upright hollyhocks, I say. "They've really let it run to seed," remarked Mrs. Pilling, who was stationed near the door with her basket of knitting, to anyone who would admit listening. "I saw it from the corner of the street last week, almost as if it's daring someone to do something about it." Her companion, a retired schoolmaster named Mr. Warbeck, coughed politely into his hand. "I dare say, Mrs. Pilling, a house has a way of reflecting the household within. Empty house, empty history, empty ambition. A truism, I think." Mrs. Pilling frowned at the remark, though whether in offence or puzzlement it was impossible to discern. Inside the hall, Purbright stood by the side, hands clasped behind his back, wearing a coat whose colour could only be described as dignifiedly indeterminate, and a bowler hat that lent him an air of measured attention. He watched the growing crowd with his customary patience, noting the shifts in posture and the subtle differences between genuine curiosity and performative interest. It was not an art of observation that drew attention, for he did not frown or startle. It was the quiet, persistent presence of a man who appeared to know more than he let on, but who also knew when it was prudent not to demonstrate it. The auction commenced with the usual formality. Mr. Pembroke, a gentleman whose enthusiasm rarely outpaced his severe wig, tapped the gavel. "Ladies and gentlemen, the property of your consideration this morning is the Creighton residence, on Northgate Lane. Empty, yes, but with all the charm and character one might wish for in a fine old town." There were polite murmurs of agreement, though these tended more toward murmurs of incredulity than excitement. Flaxborough had seen many such auctions and many such houses, and a certain communal scepticism accompanied each. The bidding began slowly. £500, then 6, then 6.50. Mrs. Pilling pinched her knitting in mild horror, while Mr. Warbeck muttered something about inflation and the imprudence of our times. And yet, by 10:15, the figure had reached an almost respectable sum. Then something peculiar occurred. A man, appearing quite suddenly from the back, raised his hand and said, in a voice that combined authority with a faint, awkward tremor, "I'll take it for £120. A murmur ran through the hall. This was more than the current bid, but not impossibly so. Mr. Pembroke, slightly startled, peered over his spectacles. "Sir," I said, £120. "For the house?" A brief discussion followed regarding the legitimacy of the bid. The man produced a neatly folded cheque from his pocket. It was entirely proper in appearance, and entirely unexpected in its source. After a moment's hesitation, Mr. Pembroke allowed the bid, and the gavel came down. The auction was concluded. Purbright had observed the proceedings with his usual restraint. The man was of average height, perhaps 45, with thinning hair and a jacket that suggested careful attention to detail, though little flair. There was nothing overtly criminal in his appearance. Rather, it was the suddenness, the context, and the almost imperceptible rigidity of his stance that gave Purbright the faintest pause. But the town reacted in ways far more vocal than he might have anticipated. "I knew it," exclaimed Mrs. Pilling, clutching her basket. "Somebody always swoops in at the last minute."
"You mark my words, he'll sell it on again next week for twice that."
"Or worse," said Mrs. Crabtree, the tobacconist's wife. "He'll move in and let it go to ruin. Just like the Creightons always did, poor things."
"There's a curse on that house, I always said so." Others whispered in corners, variously speculating about foreign investment, dodgy inheritances, or the man's possible identity.
By 11 o'clock, it seemed that half the town knew not only who had bought the house, but what his motives were. Despite none of them having spoken to him, Purbright, however, noted the silence that lingered elsewhere. The quiet glance exchanged between the auctioneer and a tall, narrow gentleman at the back. The man did not speak, did not approach, but he stood with the decorum of someone whose mind was, for reasons entirely unexpressed, calculating. It was that glance, unnoticed by most, that suggested the peculiar event had ramifications beyond the simple exchange of funds for brick and mortar. Later, in the slightly chilled air of the auction hall, Purbright conversed briefly with Mr. Pembroke, curious.
"Isn't it?" said the auctioneer, adjusting his wig.
"One never sees such interest in a house that's been empty for decades." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, though sometimes," he said carefully, "it is the emptiness itself that attracts attention. A blank canvas invites the imagination of the occupant or the observer." Mr. Pembroke blinked, as though unsure whether to take that as compliment or mild reproach. The new owner, meanwhile, departed briskly, neither glancing back nor engaging in the town gossip that followed him like the shadow of a bell tower. He was gone before lunch, leaving the hall to empty chatter and the faint smell of varnish and damp plaster. Purbright lingered just long enough to make brief, polite inquiries of the onlookers. Did anyone notice anything unusual about the man?
"No, of course not."
Did anyone recall him in town previously?
"Only vague recollections, often contradictory."
And yet there was something, slight but tangible, that suggested this auction was not merely the transaction of a house, but a quiet, imperceptible disruption to Flaxborough's rhythm, a gentle ripple in an otherwise sedate pond. By the time Purbright returned to his office, the town had resumed its usual order, albeit with an undertone of excitement that made the local grocer's gossip more animated than usual, and Purbright, carefully arranging his papers, made a note to inquire further, not of the auction, nor of the house itself, but of the curious tension that had briefly occupied the air. Small, subtle, and entirely ordinary, and yet somehow very much worth observing, for in Flaxborough it was often the quietest moments, the smallest deviations, that whispered the loudest truths. By mid-morning, the town of Flaxborough had entered the familiar phase that followed any event of minor distinction. The multiplication of conjecture. Mrs. Pilling's knitting basket was now accompanied by an audience of 3 other ladies, each leaning forward with a mixture of curiosity and self-righteous indignation. The subject, of course, was the sudden appearance of the man who had purchased the Crayton house, and the unusually brisk sum at which he had secured it. "I knew it was far too convenient," said Mrs. Crabtree, clasping her hands over the waistcoat of her apron, a stranger swooping in without warning. "You mark my words, he has intentions not in keeping with the town's character." Mrs. Pilling tutted, adjusting her spectacles. "Character? He may have character in spades, but do we know anything of him? Not a soul. I dare say he could be anything from a foreign speculator to a gentleman with very poor taste." Even as they spoke, Mr. Warbeck had joined the group, moving with deliberate slowness as though the act of being present lent legitimacy to his judgments. "I would counsel moderation," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "It is entirely possible that the man has impeccable credentials, or conversely, a most reprehensible taste for disorder. But I would caution against assuming the worst without the proper evidence." The ladies were not persuaded. Indeed, they were rarely persuaded by anything short of outright calamity. The story had already taken on a life of its own. Whispers of secret inheritances, hidden passages, and even ghosts found their way into every corner of conversation. At the same time, the Crichton house itself had begun to cast a more insistent shadow upon the town's imagination. The old gates, with paint flaking in elegant patterns, seemed to invite speculation about the new occupant's habits. A postman passing by remarked, half to himself and half to the pigeons, that the house looked as if it were expecting trouble. Purbright, meanwhile, remained unaffected by the chorus of opinion. He spent a quiet hour at his desk, reviewing the auction records and jotting down small observations. The suddenness of the final bid, the unfamiliarity of the purchaser, and the subtle tension in the auctioneer's expressions. There was nothing concrete, nothing overt, yet he had learned to trust the faint vibrations of human behavior. They often spoke louder than any paper record could. By lunchtime, the murmurs had reached the railway buffet, where railwaymen and occasional travellers joined in the speculation.
"I saw him leave," said a porter with a coat too large for his frame, "and he carried himself like a man with something to hide."
Not a crook, mind you, but not one to leave his business exposed either. The station master nodded sagely. That's the trouble with empty houses. They're canvases for projection. Everyone sees in them what they want or what they fear. At the same moment, across town, Mr. Pembroke was quietly speaking to a few of the more observant townsfolk. He had noted that the stranger had asked unusually detailed questions about the house's previous owners, including the precise dates of occupancy, rather than its structural peculiarities. Not the sort of interest a mere investor might take, he commented.
"Curious, wouldn't you say?"
Purbright, on his habitual afternoon walk through the market square, overheard fragments of these discussions and noted them without comment. He observed a tall, narrow gentleman speaking with unusual intensity to a fruit seller and a clerk from the registry office pacing with a notebook under his arm. Each encounter was brief, polite, and yet tinged with the subtlest undercurrent of unease, a tone Purbright stored carefully in his mental ledger. By mid-afternoon, he decided it was time to visit the house itself. He did so in a quiet manner, introducing himself to the new owner with courteous formality, noting the man's mild startle at seeing a local inspector in what he may have assumed would be a private visit. They spoke briefly entirely about the house and the minimal repairs required. Nothing in the man's words betrayed malice, yet his eyes betrayed an unusual vigilance, flickering to windows and corners as though assessing their capacity for observation. The Crichton house, though silent and empty, offered more than mere architecture. Its rooms, each decorated with the faded remnants of careful domesticity, seemed almost to whisper of their former inhabitants' habits and secrets. Purbright moved with a deliberate calm, noting the position of a misplaced ink pot, the way a chair had been shifted slightly from its usual alignment, and a door that clicked differently than it had in earlier years. Each observation was filed carefully, a layer of quiet evidence added to his understanding. As he returned to the town, the whispers continued, growing in intricacy and drama. The idea that the man might be a recluse, a millionaire, or even a foreign agent circulated in turn, each iteration more elaborate than the last. Purbright's own thought, however, remained measured. There was a peculiarity here, a tension between what was seen and what was inferred, yet no cause for alarm, only curiosity. In the quiet of his office, he made notes on the conversation, the minor gestures, the minute deviations from expected behavior. He pondered the nature of Flaxborough itself, its reliance on routine, and the way a single, subtle change, the arrival of a stranger, and the quiet acquisition of an empty house, could ripple outward through the town's social fabric. By evening, the town had settled into a kind of anticipatory hush. The streets were busy with routine errands, but every shopkeeper, postman, and passer-by seemed to carry a private speculation. Purbright, watching the final glow of sunlight on the cobbles from his office window, understood that the town was not troubled by crime, nor scandal, nor even by the man himself. It was troubled by the unexpected, by the breach in the carefully maintained rhythm of their lives. And often, he reflected, it was in such breaches that the most revealing truths would emerge. He prepared, with quiet diligence, to follow the ripple that had begun with a single bid. Somewhere in the midst of polite chatter, misremembered facts and exaggerated conjecture, there would be a thread worth tracing, subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakably present to the observant eye, and Purbright, patient as ever would be that eye, the next morning Flaxborough stirred with its habitual serenity, though beneath the surface a faint tension lingered, imperceptible to those occupied with ordinary concerns, but perceptible to the trained eye. Purbright, arriving at the station precisely at 9, noticed the subtle flutter of speculation in the air. The baker's assistant speaking in hurried whispers with a customer about the Creighton purchase, the greengrocer tidying his display with unusual deliberation, as if to distract himself from thoughts better left unexamined. The town had settled into a rhythm of curiosity, and Purbright moved quietly within it. Taking careful note, his first call was to Mrs. Crabtree, who was already preoccupied with arranging tins of tobacco in what might have been described as an ornamental precision. She welcomed him with a faint air of suspicion, as though any visitor might easily be a spy or an intruder on her personal understanding of civic events. "Inspector," she began, "I suppose you've come to inquire about that house?" One can hardly turn around without hearing the whole town's theories. "Merely to gather impressions," said Purbright, bowing slightly. "I understand you spoke to Mr. Pembroke yesterday." Mrs. Crabtree's eyebrows arched.
I may have.
"But between you and me, the auctioneer is as cautious with his words as anyone I know. He says little and looks everywhere. A fine gentleman, but prone to discretion, which is unfortunate for idle curiosity." Purbright nodded, making a careful note. Her comment was polite, and yet she had revealed the tension between the surface of propriety and the underlying energy of suspicion. Next, he visited Mr. Pembroke himself, who had returned to the town hall to sort papers and organize forthcoming sales. The auctioneer's calm was marred only by a slight tremor in his hand as he held a ledger. "It is unusual," said Pembroke, offering tea that had cooled too long, "for a stranger to act so decisively."
Not only the sum, but the manner in which he took possession.
No small talk, no curiosity about local gossip, only questions about the property's history and previous owners.
It is typical, you might say. Purbright listened, allowing silence to draw out the rest.
"And you noticed nothing else? Any companions, vehicles, or perhaps habits that seemed—"
Out of place?
Pembroke adjusted his spectacles and frowned. "A single glance, nothing more. A narrow, tall figure loitering at the rear. I cannot be certain, but he may have lingered a little too long to be a casual observer. There was a faint unease about him, a tension that even I, with my limited experience, could sense." Purbright's note-taking was discreet. The interplay of observation and understated alarm was exactly the sort of thread he required. He spent the remainder of the morning following minor leads. The postman who had delivered the auction paperwork, the grocer who had seen the purchaser pass with hurried steps, and a schoolmistress who had observed a man peering through the lattice of a garden gate. Each account was polite, careful, and, importantly, slightly contradictory. One witness claimed the purchaser smiled faintly as he left the property. Another insisted he frowned. One recalled a brief consultation with a lady in passing. Another saw him alone. Purbright stored each detail with meticulous precision. Contradiction, after all, was seldom accidental. By lunch, he returned to the town square, noting that the murmurs had evolved into a network of delicate speculation. Mrs. Pilling and her circle had gathered again, knitting and gossiping with a vigor that contrasted sharply with their usual calm demeanor. "I tell you, there is more here than meets the eye," Mrs. Pilling said. "A house that has stood empty for decades, suddenly sold at such a figure of—" It is unnatural. Perhaps it is merely coincidence, Mr. Warbeck ventured, as ever attempting a rational thread. Coincidence and nothing more. The mind does tend to embroider upon the unknown, but Purbright saw the tension in the knuckles, the small narrowing of eyes, and the subtle tilt of heads. Coincidence, perhaps, yet the town's imagination had already begun to weave its own narrative, and every minor discrepancy, every hesitation, became a kernel of intrigue. By late afternoon, Purbright had traced the purchaser to a small cafe on Northgate Lane. The man sat at a corner table, quietly reading a ledger. When Purbright approached, the man offered a polite nod and a small smile, one that did not quite reach the eyes. Conversation ensued about the property's condition, local amenities, and the customary civility of Flaxborough life.
Nothing was revealed directly,
But the man's manner, measured, guarded, and at times slightly too deliberate, left impressions that were valuable precisely because they were subtle. Purbright observed how he handled sugar tongs, how he chose which page to turn in his ledger, and the faint hesitation before replying to questions about local matters. All were minor, almost imperceptible behaviors, yet to Purbright they spoke volumes about restraint, vigilance, and the careful calibration of presence. Returning home in the fading light, Purbright contemplated the contradictions he had collected, polite statements that suggested concealment, observed actions that defied casual interpretation, and the network of town whispers that simultaneously exaggerated and obscured the truth. Each was a piece of a puzzle, and he understood that the real difficulty lay not in uncovering the overt, but in discerning the motives beneath the ordinary facades of civility. That evening, in his quiet office, he began arranging the observations with precision. Contradiction, he noted, was often a deliberate signal. Politeness could mask impatience, smiles could disguise concern, and attention to minutiae could conceal intent. The town's gossip was revealing, not for its accuracy, but for its patterns, its omissions, and the slight inconsistencies that emerged when accounts were compared carefully. As the gas lamps flickered along the cobbled streets, Purbright prepared for the next stage of his subtle inquiries. Each minor observation from the morning, each polite contradiction, would guide the questions he would ask, the paths he would follow, and the tests he would place before the individuals who had become, by circumstance or choice, enmeshed in the curious tension surrounding the Crichton house. In Flaxborough, the ordinary was seldom ordinary for long, and Purbright, patient and precise, understood that the first careful probes often revealed more than overt investigation ever could. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into the familiar rhythm of small-town observation, yet beneath the calm surface the crests and troughs of speculation continued to swell. The purchase of the Crichton house had become, in whispers and half-uttered phrases, a source of mild scandal, particularly for those who enjoyed drawing conclusions from incomplete evidence. The town's machinery of conjecture operated at full capacity, and it produced a convenient scapegoat almost before the day had begun. Mr. Carraway, proprietor of the local tobacconist and a man of precise habits, was the first to circulate a theory. "If I were to hazard a guess," he murmured to the grocer across the square, "the stranger may have had assistance. One rarely sees such a rapid transaction handled alone." The grocer nodded in exaggerated agreement, folding his apron with deliberate solemnity. From this tiny spark the gossip quickly ignited. By mid-morning the new purchaser was described, alternately, as a wealthy foreigner, a descendant of the Crichtons seeking to reclaim ancestral property, and, most elaborately, a potential fraudster attempting to conceal some unspecified impropriety. Purbright observed all of this with patient detachment. There was a curious efficiency in the town's ability to fill gaps in knowledge with assumptions, each narrative supported more by wish or fear than by fact. He noted the contrasts between what the witnesses claimed to have seen and the improbable stories they had invented, storing each discrepancy for careful examination. The first obvious suspect, then, was not a person, but a persona created by the collective imagination, one that suited the town's appetite for intrigue. Nonetheless, a figure had emerged whose circumstances made him, however unfairly, a natural focus, Mr. Langford, a retired banker habitually seen lurking near the auction hall during prior sales. He had expressed interest in the property earlier, but had been outbid. Now, in light of the sudden acquisition by a stranger, townsfolk whispered that he had reasons for resentment, perhaps even motives for interference. Some suggested that he might have attempted to manipulate the purchase through proxies, or to intimidate the new owner. Purbright, in his measured way, paid Mr. Langford a brief visit. The banker's residence was a compact brick house on Maple Street, neat to the point of rigidity, with every item precisely in place. Langford himself was a man of mild build and deliberate speech, exuding the dignity of long practice in the subtle art of financial persuasion. He welcomed Purbright politely, offering tea and a comfortable chair, and answered questions about his interest in the Crichton house with precise accuracy. "I did indeed attend the auction," he admitted, "and had hopes of acquiring the property."
That I was unsuccessful is a mild disappointment, nothing more. His hands were folded, fingers interlaced, and his expression was courteous but firm.
"I have no involvement with the purchaser, nor any intention to influence events retrospectively. It is, I assure you, as simple as that." Purbright listened attentively, allowing silence to press against the edges of conversation. It was the quiet, unassuming contradictions that intrigued him. Langford's calm politeness, the way he occasionally glanced toward a window as though noting passing figures, and the faint twitch of his left eyebrow, all were minute, yet they suggested a vigilance that went beyond ordinary interest. Not evidence, certainly, but enough to merit careful attention. Outside, the town continued to elaborate its own narrative. Mrs. Pilling, now joined by 3 other ladies, discussed the purchase in hushed yet emphatic tones.
"I dare say Mr. Langford might have had a hand in this," she said, knitting needles clicking.
"He always was a man who expected to get his own way, and now he has failed. You mark my words, he may seek redress in ways that are—"
"Unconventional. The very notion."
exclaimed Mrs. Crabtree. "To think he would stoop to interference."
"And yet—"
Her trailing voice suggested she found the possibility not entirely improbable. The dynamic was compounded by subtle contradictions in the accounts that reached Purbright from other sources. One witness insisted that Langford had spent the afternoon walking near the Crichton property, while another claimed he had been entirely occupied with his own business. One asserted that he had muttered complaints to a friend, another that he had appeared unconcerned and composed. These fragments, inconsistent yet persistent, formed the first layer of the puzzle, a suspect convenient not because of overt guilt, but because human nature preferred neat conclusions. By afternoon, Purbright had chosen to observe Mr. Langford in motion. The banker visited the market, greeted townsfolk with customary politeness, and managed transactions with precise efficiency. There was nothing overtly incriminating, yet the slight stiffness in posture, the habitual scanning of the periphery, and the occasional, near imperceptible hesitation before responding to remarks suggested a careful calculation of impression. Purbright filed each observation, understanding that the truth rarely lay in the obvious, but in the interaction between behavior, context, and expectation. Meanwhile, the purchaser of the Crichton house remained largely absent from public view, allowing the town's narratives to flourish unchecked. By evening, the gossip had developed a rhythm. Langford as thwarted opportunist, mysterious stranger as potential interloper, and the Crichton house itself as a catalyst for latent social tensions. Purbright recognized the pattern: convenient suspect, embellished motive, embellished actions, and prepared to examine it further, not with accusation, but with the subtle tests that would reveal the contours of truth hidden beneath civility. He returned to his office at dusk, the gas lamps casting long shadows on the walls, and considered the day's findings. The first obvious suspect had emerged through social momentum rather than evidence. Yet within this apparent simplicity, there were threads to be traced, contradictions to explore, and subtle deviations from expectation that might ultimately guide the investigation toward its quieter, more intricate truths. In Flaxborough, it was seldom the explicit act that mattered most, but the manner in which ordinary people responded and the small, almost imperceptible cues that marked intention and hesitation. Purbright, as always, understood that patience and measured observation were the instruments with which such puzzles were unravelled. The day ended with the town abuzz, yet the inspector's mind was focused on the tiny anomalies, gestures, glances, and the interplay of polite statements against the faintly uneasy undercurrent of the everyday. He knew that the first suspect, convenient though he might seem, was merely the outward expression of a deeper, more intricate rhythm, one he intended to follow with his characteristic precision. The morning was damp with mist, and Flaxborough seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of small but notable events. Purbright walked slowly through the streets, observing the town in its habitual rhythm, shopkeepers arranging their wares with meticulous care, children skipping along the cobbles, and a few elderly gentlemen lingering by the fountain, exchanging news that was rarely news at all. Yet beneath this apparent calm, the peculiar tension surrounding the Creighton house persisted, like an invisible thread drawing the town's attention into unexpected alignments. It was during a visit to the market that Purbright first noticed the trivial anomaly that would occupy his thoughts, a solitary umbrella, black and modestly worn,
leaning against the stand of Mr. Carraway, the tobacconist.
It seemed entirely unremarkable, except that no rain had fallen since the previous evening, and umbrellas in Flaxborough were rarely left unattended. Purbright's gaze lingered, noting the slight scrape on the handle, the way the fabric hung unevenly, and the faint smudge of mud near the tip. Small details, he reminded himself, often carried significance beyond immediate perception. Mrs. Pilling and her companions were nearby, voices hushed as always. "I saw it there this morning," she said, nodding toward the umbrella. "I cannot imagine whose it might be."
Perhaps a passerby?
Or one of those new residents taking liberties with public property. Her eyes flicked to the Creighton house, though the connection was unspoken, instinctive. Purbright made a quiet note to inquire about ownership. He approached Mr. Carraway with the utmost politeness, allowing the tobacconist to feel in control of the exchange. "Good morning, Mr. Carraway. I wonder if you might recall whether this umbrella belongs to anyone in particular." The tobacconist adjusted his spectacles and peered at the object.
"Ah, yes. Strange thing, that."
"It was leaning against the stand when I arrived, though I am certain none of my regular customers left it there. One might assume it belongs to a visitor, but I have no certainty. It does seem oddly placed, though, doesn't it?" Purbright's observation extended beyond the umbrella itself. There was a subtle imprint on the pavement where it had rested, slight enough to be overlooked by casual attention, but distinct in its alignment toward the Creighton house. The angle, the proximity, and the quiet insistence of its presence suggested intention, however faint. As he moved on, he encountered Mr. Warbeck, who had taken his customary place near the fountain. The retired schoolmaster was ever alert to minor irregularities in daily life, and he remarked upon the umbrella with the air of one disclosing an enigma. "You see, Inspector, even the smallest thing can betray intention. A misplaced object, a glance, a hesitation. These are the cues that the unwary miss. Do not underestimate the value of subtlety." Purbright acknowledged the remark with polite interest, filing it with others in his mental ledger. Subtlety, indeed, was often more revealing than overt action. It was a pattern he had observed countless times. Ordinary objects became instruments of insight, and ordinary gestures took on amplified meaning in the context of human behavior. The remainder of the morning was spent tracing the likely path of the umbrella. Purbright noted footprints in the soft mud near the fountain, subtle abrasions on a nearby stone, and faint marks along the cobbles suggesting careful placement and retrieval. Each detail was minor, but collectively they pointed toward deliberate intention, the sort that did not announce itself but existed nonetheless in the almost imperceptible adjustments of the environment. By midday, he had questioned several passers-by, each account fragmentary and contradictory. One man recalled seeing a figure with a coat too long and a hat slightly askew, while another insisted the figure carried something else entirely, perhaps a briefcase or parcel. These discrepancies, minor though they seemed, deepened the mystery. The ordinary observer saw only the scene itself, while Purbright discerned the alignment of motives, hesitation, and caution behind the apparent randomness. In the afternoon, the umbrella was incidentally observed by Mrs. Crabtree, who had come to purchase a packet of tobacco. She recoiled slightly at the sight.
Why would anyone leave an umbrella here? It is so very deliberate, don't you think?
And near the Crichton house, of all places. Her emphasis on the location was telling. It suggested that the town's collective imagination had already begun to endow ordinary objects with narrative weight. Purbright, however, weighed the tangible against the imagined. The object was trivial, but its position, alignment, and the slight smudges of soil indicated care. There was a story here, subtle and understated, and he intended to trace it quietly without alarm or spectacle. Small, inconspicuous events often presaged larger revelations, and the alignment of trivialities was his preferred instrument of discovery. As the evening fell, Purbright returned to his office, the gas lamps flickering and casting elongated shadows across his desk. He reviewed his notes, the auction, the convenient suspect, the town's whispers, and now this seemingly insignificant umbrella. In combination, the details suggested a pattern that was not yet obvious, an undercurrent beneath the polite surface of Flaxborough life. He considered human habits, the careful concealment of intention, and the subtle messages embedded in gestures, objects, and timing. Each observation, when isolated, might appear inconsequential. Yet, in combination, they provided the rhythm of behavior, the cadence of purpose, and the faintly discernible logic of action beneath the veneer of civility. Purbright's reflections extended into the night, a quiet meditation on the ways ordinary people, acting from instinct, curiosity, or self-interest, generated a lattice of interaction that, if traced with care, could reveal truths invisible to casual perception. The misplaced umbrella was a small anomaly, but anomalies rarely existed without cause. By the time he extinguished the desk lamp and closed the office door, he had resolved to follow the subtle trail the object had laid out. In Flaxborough, as always, it was the smallest deviations, the most trivial discrepancies, that whispered the loudest secrets. And Purbright, with his characteristic patience and attentiveness, understood that attention to such detail would, in due course, illuminate the hidden currents of human intent. The following day brought with it a quiet bustle in Flaxborough, as if the town itself were adjusting to the new presence of the Crichton house purchaser. Ordinary routines were maintained with precision, yet the shadow of curiosity and latent tension lingered in subtle ways. The baker slid loaves across the counter with exaggerated attention to alignment. The grocer counted coins with unusual care, and pedestrians seemed to glance more frequently toward Northgate Lane than necessity demanded. Purbright noted all of this with habitual patience, his mind attuned to the interplay of civility and unspoken concern that marked Flaxborough's social rhythm. He began his morning with a brief visit to the railway station, where the porter spoke of an unfamiliar figure he had seen lingering near the ticket office, notebook in hand, as though taking notes on those passing through. "I don't rightly know what he wanted," the man said, shrugging, "but he looked careful, very careful." Purbright observed that the description was deliberately vague, yet the tone betrayed an instinctive sense of importance attached to a minor encounter. Small, repeated impressions such as these were often more telling than elaborate statements. By mid-morning, Purbright made his way to the market square, where the usual cluster of gossiping ladies had expanded to include a few new faces: the assistant at the town library, a recently widowed grocer's daughter, and a young clerk from the council office. Each brought a subtle variation on the Crichton story, coloured by personal experience and minor grievances. One recalled a faintly overheard remark about renovation plans, another a hurriedly concealed visit to the property by the new owner, and another a sighting of a small, unmarked carriage parked near the gate in the early morning. The composite of these observations created a mosaic of social tension and behavioural nuance. Purbright was less concerned with the literal truth of each account than with the consistencies and inconsistencies in delivery, hesitations, emphasis, gestures, and fleeting glances. From these he could discern patterns which, though invisible to the casual observer, outlined the contours of intent, curiosity, and occasionally deception. During a brief afternoon interlude, Purbright visited the newly acquired house. The purchaser was engaged in arranging minor repairs and inspecting the property with meticulous attention. Purbright observed him unobtrusively, the careful adjustment of window latches, the selection of a particular chair to test stability, and the faint tension in his shoulders that suggested a conscious effort to project calm. It was the sort of behaviour that would appear mundane to most, yet to Purbright it was suggestive of deliberate concealment, of an individual keenly aware of observation and yet determined not to betray the smallest hint of motive. Back in town, the library assistant contributed a minor yet significant detail, a ledger of previous occupants she had examined, noting entries for minor repairs and personal correspondence. One notation, concerning the removal of an old key from a drawer, appeared trivial, yet its existence suggested deliberate care in property management, which in turn implied a purchaser attuned to the subtleties of domestic history. Purbright recorded the information quietly, aware that minor, seemingly inconsequential acts often revealed the more telling aspects of human intent. By late afternoon, Purbright observed Mr. Langford moving deliberately through the streets, interacting with townsfolk in measured ways, offering polite, perfunctory greetings while observing responses. It was as if he were testing the town's perception of himself, calibrating impression against expectation. The juxtaposition of his behaviour with that of the new purchaser highlighted the subtle divergences in human strategy. One engaged with social conformity, the other with self-contained, meticulous attention to circumstance. In the market square, the gossip network expanded further. Observers speculated on the possibility of clandestine meetings between Langford and the purchaser, interpreting innocuous gestures as signs of intrigue. Small children, drawn by the novelty of whispered conversations, repeated fragments to adults who embellished them into patterns of conspiracy and intention. Purbright noted with his usual quiet satisfaction that these social constructions were as revealing of character as any overt action. As evening approached, he returned to his office, reviewing the day's observations with the care of a scholar examining minute textual differences. The threads of minor irregularities, social interplay, and behavioral divergence coalesced into a lattice of potential significance. Each townsperson, consciously or not, had contributed to a network of information, layered with embellishments and contradictions, through which the subtle architecture of motive and attention could be discerned. Purbright reflected upon the necessity of patience, of allowing each element to reveal itself in due course. Flaxborough's quiet routines, the trivial anomalies, and the layering of social signals were all instruments through which the hidden aspects of human intent could be measured. The interplay of curiosity, suspicion, and civility provided a framework for understanding that required no spectacle, no overt confrontation, only the careful alignment of observation, inference, and timing. Before retiring for the evening, he made a final note: the patterns were emerging, not in isolated acts, but in their orchestration, in the subtle interactions that marked human behavior in a town where predictability was the common currency. and deviation the signal worth observing. The next day, he reflected, would likely bring further revelations, each minor but collectively instrumental in untangling the quiet complexities surrounding the Creighton house. Purbright extinguished his desk lamp and gazed briefly out the window at the dimly lit streets, noting the flicker of lamps in shop windows, the distant footfalls on cobblestones, and the faint silhouette of the house against a darkening sky. Every detail, every small intrusion, every subtle deviation from routine had potential significance, and he, patient as ever, would trace the connections layer upon layer until the patterns yielded their hidden truth. It was a late autumn morning, crisp and bright, though the light seemed unusually sharp on the cobbled streets of Flaxborough. Purbright, walking at his customary measured pace, observed the market square with the same meticulous attention he applied to every detail. Yet, beneath the everyday rhythm there existed a subtle undercurrent of unease. News had spread overnight that something unusual had occurred at the Creighton house, a minor disturbance reported by a nearby tenant. That had been amplified into whispered conjecture by the time the inspector arrived. A young maid from the adjacent property was the first to speak. Her voice, soft yet precise, described an odd event, the sound of shuffling furniture, doors opening and closing, and a single muffled exclamation, though she insisted she could not see who had caused it. Purbright listened attentively, noting the careful way she distinguished between observation and supposition. There was no panic in her account, only the peculiar focus of one who had witnessed a deviation from ordinary routine. The inspector moved on to the scene itself. The Creighton house appeared unchanged, its facade calm and unremarkable, though the garden carried traces of recent activity, footprints in the soft soil, a chair slightly displaced from its usual alignment, and a faint scent of linseed oil suggesting some form of domestic intervention. Each element, minor and mundane, was catalogued by Purbright with quiet precision, forming a composite picture that hinted at human presence and deliberate action without revealing its exact purpose. In the town, the rumour had already taken on its own life. Mrs. Pilling and her companion speculated that the disturbance might be evidence of illicit occupation, or even the start of some more elaborate scheme involving the previously noted stranger and, perhaps, Mr. Langford. "I dare say the house itself seems to invite interference," Mrs. Pilling remarked, knitting needles clicking as she spoke. "One cannot imagine such a place remaining undisturbed for long." Mr. Warbeck, ever the voice of cautious reason, suggested moderation, but the town's fascination could not be restrained. Observers noted the arrival of a small delivery cart and the brief appearance of a uniformed official, though neither event was explained clearly. Purbright recorded each observation, recognizing that the most revealing aspects of human behavior often lay in what people omitted or hesitated to describe. Inside the house, the cause of the disturbance proved less dramatic than the gossip suggested. A misplaced box of old papers had fallen from a shelf during inspection, scattering letters and ledgers across the floor. To an ordinary observer it would have been trivial. To Purbright, the incident offered a glimpse into the patterns of the new occupant. Careful, precise, yet occasionally prone to minor miscalculations, all of which revealed character without the need for explicit disclosure. As he examined the documents, Purbright noted one small anomaly, a letter envelope neatly sealed, yet addressed in handwriting that was not entirely consistent with the other papers. Its presence suggested either an oversight or deliberate concealment. He did not open it immediately, recognizing that its significance lay not in immediate revelation, but in the opportunity to observe responses and interactions later. Returning to the town, he encountered Mr. Langford, who had arrived to conduct a routine inspection of a nearby property. Langford's expression, courteous yet guarded, betrayed the slightest tension when the subject of the Creighton house arose. He inquired politely about the minor disturbance, though his eyes, as Purbright observed, flicked briefly toward the direction of the house itself. The subtle alignment of question and gaze, and the faint tightening around the jaw, indicated engagement without overt disclosure. Throughout the afternoon, the ripple of the incident spread quietly. Postmen, shopkeepers, and the occasional passerby mentioned the mysterious noises and the minor activity in the house, embellishing the account just enough to maintain intrigue without alarming anyone. Purbright catalogued each report, noting discrepancies and consistencies alike, the timing, the sequence of sounds, the number of people supposedly present, and the various objects mentioned. Each account, while trivial in isolation, contributed to a complex web of observation and inference. By evening, Purbright returned to his office, reviewing the day's findings. The incident, minor though it seemed, had shifted the focus of attention.
What had been a convenient suspect, Mr. Langford?
The socially vigilant town banker now shared attention with the new occupant of the house, whose meticulous habits and occasional slips suggested subtle human complexity rather than criminal intent. The narrative had expanded, and with it the need for careful observation, for noting not only the obvious but the faintest of gestures, the smallest of misalignments, and the quiet interplay of curiosity, intention, and accident. Purbright reflected upon the human habit of assigning significance to small events,
Often exaggerating the ordinary into drama.
Yet in this instance, the ordinary itself contained layers of meaning, minor errors, slight hesitations, and the juxtaposition of meticulous care with inadvertent disruption provided insight into the character and intentions of those involved. The task, as ever, was to trace these patterns with patience and discretion, allowing the behaviors to speak more clearly than any declarative statement could. Before extinguishing the lamp, he considered the broader picture, the first convenient suspect, the careful stranger, the network of observers in the town, and now this minor but telling incident. Each element interacted subtly with the others, creating a lattice of information and inference that required neither accusation nor alarm to reveal its significance. Patience, attention, and subtle deduction would, as always, provide the means to illuminate the truth. Once the proper sequence of observation and reflection had been completed, in Flaxborough,
ordinary life continued, the streets calm, the shops orderly,
and the people polite. Yet beneath the surface, small shifts and deviations marked the slow, deliberate evolution of understanding. Purbright, sitting in quiet contemplation, recognized that the second incident, minor though it appeared, had altered the trajectory of observation, emphasizing the complexity of human behavior and the subtle, often concealed motives that lay behind even the simplest acts. That evening, Purbright sat alone in his office, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting a quiet pool of light across papers carefully arranged in neat stacks. Outside, the streets of Flaxborough were hushed, with the occasional clatter of a distant cart or the muted chatter of late pedestrians drifting faintly through the night air. It was in these moments of solitude that he often reflected, tracing the subtle patterns of behavior that revealed more than words ever could. He considered the recent events surrounding the Crichton house, the auction, the arrival of the stranger, the minor disturbance of the misplaced box, and the pervasive speculation of the townsfolk. Each incident, minor in itself, had generated ripples across the town, revealing layers of social expectation, concern, and latent ambition. It was not crime in the dramatic sense that intrigued him, but the quiet revelations of human nature, the way individuals revealed themselves through gestures, omissions, and the faintest deviations from routine. Purbright thought of Mr. Langford, whose comportment suggested a carefully cultivated public persona. Politeness, vigilance, and social calibration formed the outward veneer, yet beneath it, the slight tension, the carefully measured glances, and the occasional hesitation hinted at subtle anxieties. He was, Purbright reflected, an exemplar of the ways in which civility could both reveal and conceal. The stranger who had purchased the house presented a different pattern altogether. His meticulous care, occasional missteps, and guarded behavior indicated an individual accustomed to planning, yet cautious of attention. Purbright considered the implications. A man who managed his environment with care, responded to minor deviations with prompt adjustment, and yet, in the midst of that control, allowed small, telling anomalies. A chair slightly askew, a misaligned letter, a footprint, in damp soil to escape notice. These were clues not in the act itself, but in the balance between precision and oversight. He reflected on the townsfolk whose gossip, embellishments, and contradictions were themselves a form of insight. Flaxborough, in its orderly way, produced a network of observation that was unintentional yet revealing. The same whispers that seemed to mislead also illuminated patterns of attention, expectation, and assumption. Each account, each recollection, carried significance not in literal truth, but in the choice to say one thing and withhold another, to emphasize or omit, to observe consciously or unconsciously. The minor incidents, such as the misplaced umbrella, the shifted furniture, and the scattered papers, were more than disruptions of routine. They were instruments through which character revealed itself. Purbright noted that people often underestimated the information embedded in these trivialities, yet they were, in aggregate, more revealing than overt declarations. Human behavior, in its minutiae, disclosed intent and temperament more accurately than testimony alone. He contemplated the lattice of interactions he had observed, gestures, glances, pauses, and polite interjections. The interplay of civility and suspicion, attention, and distraction allowed him to infer the deeper currents of motive. Flaxborough's social fabric, ordinarily stable and predictable, had been subtly altered by the arrival of the stranger and the reactions he provoked. Each minor deviation from expectation acted as a signal if one knew how to read it, and Purbright's expertise lay precisely in this discernment. As he reviewed his notes, he considered timing and sequence as well. The appearance of individuals, their choice of words, and the order in which observations occurred were not accidental. There was, he realized, a rhythm to these interactions, a cadence of inquiry, reaction, and adjustment, each layer informing the next. Recognizing that rhythm was as important as noting discrete facts, he reflected on his own role in the process. Patience was not passive, it was active observation, careful listening, and the restraint to allow events and people to reveal themselves in due course. Intervention, when required, had to be precise, subtle, and deliberate, designed not to provoke but to elicit responses that might illuminate intent. It was a quiet discipline requiring attentiveness, judgment, and an understanding of human psychology that went beyond obvious behavior. By the time he rose from his chair, the gas lamp flickering low, Purbright had reached a clear understanding. The incidents, the characters, and the minor anomalies were all interlinked, forming a network that, if traced patiently, would reveal the truth behind the apparent disorder. He knew that the next steps would require carefully staged observations, judicious inquiries, and the continued alignment of subtle behavior against expectation. The town's ordinary routine, the polite constraints of social interaction, and the small deviations in conduct were all instruments through which insight would be gained. He extinguished the lamp, noting the quiet solidity of the night outside his window. Flaxborough slept with only the faintest hum of life in the streets, yet the invisible currents of human behavior were active, moving imperceptibly through the town. And Purbright, as ever, would attend to them quietly, patiently, and with the precision that allowed him to discern the hidden motives that lay beneath civility. The evening's reflections provided not answers, but clarity of method, patience, Attentiveness and subtle observation were the means to trace human intent. In Flaxborough, the ordinary rarely concealed ordinary truths, and Purbright knew that when the proper moment arrived, the interplay of minor incidents, contradictions, and behavior would converge to illuminate the unseen patterns of cause and consequence. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke under a pale sun, with the mist of previous days replaced by a clarity that made the cobbles shine faintly and highlighted the sharp angles of the Crichton house. Purbright, taking his usual measured walk through the market square, noted the subtle signs of town gossip already in motion, glances toward Northgate Lane, faintly raised eyebrows in passing conversation, and the careful positioning of individuals who might overhear or intercept news. The rhythms of curiosity and caution were as revealing as any document or statement, and he used them to guide his next move. He decided to set a small, deliberate test to observe reactions. Nothing overt, no confrontation, merely a staged circumstance designed to provoke subtle responses. The object in question was the misaligned ledger and the letter he had observed days before at the Crichton house. He arranged for a courier to accidentally leave the envelope addressed to the new occupant at the corner of the market where Mr. Langford and several other interested parties were likely to see it. Its placement was carefully noted. Its handling would reveal the attentiveness, caution, or pretense of those observing. As expected, Langford arrived shortly thereafter, moving through the square with measured politeness, acknowledging townsfolk with a nod and faint smile. His gaze, however, fell upon the envelope, and Purbright observed the near imperceptible hesitation before his steps continued. A slight tightening of the lips, a micro-adjustment of posture, suggested recognition without disclosure. A subtle engagement with the situation, revealing both awareness and restraint. Nearby, the assistant at the library, who had previously mentioned the ledger and letters, noticed the envelope as well, but made no move to approach it. Her glance was fleeting, the slightest hint of curiosity, yet quickly redirected to more ordinary concerns. The contrast between her reaction and Langford's provided Purbright with immediate insight into the differential responses of those involved. He then observed the stranger who had purchased the Crichton house, arriving on schedule from the Northgate Lane direction. He paused, noted the envelope, and with meticulous care retrieved it without attracting attention. The precision of the act, the avoidance of drawing notice, and the controlled manner in which he continued on his way all indicated the same disciplined vigilance that Purbright had observed during prior visits. The man's behavior, while entirely unobtrusive, revealed a highly attuned awareness of observation, a subtle calibration of action to expectation, and a careful concealment of motive. Purbright continued his walk, blending unobtrusively with the crowd, noting the micro-expressions, gestures, and timing of reactions. The townsfolk, observing only fragments of the interaction, began to speculate quietly among themselves. Mrs. Pilling remarked to Mrs. Crabtree on the suspicious behaviour of the new occupant, while a grocer suggested that Langford might have orchestrated the placement of the envelope, despite no evidence beyond the perception of alignment. Such conjectures were not irrelevant. They reflected the town's social logic, its mechanisms of suspicion, and the minor embellishments that often amplified or obscured intention. Returning to his office in the late afternoon, Purbright reviewed the results of his subtle test. Each individual had responded in a manner consistent with prior observations. Langford, with polite vigilance tempered by minor anxiety, the purchaser with meticulous care and self-restraint, and the peripheral witnesses with curiosity tempered by social caution. The interactions were minor, almost invisible, yet collectively they formed a lattice of behavior that spoke more clearly than direct questioning could have accomplished. He reflected on the importance of timing, positioning, and subtle interference. The test had neither revealed explicit motive nor imposed overt pressure, yet it had elicited responses that illuminated character, intention, and the relationship between the parties. Purbright considered how each action, each hesitation, and each micro-adjustment might be interpreted not in isolation, but within the broader context of social expectations and private concern. As evening approached, he took stock of the patterns emerging from the day's observations. The convenient suspect, Langford, while displaying minor anxiety and vigilance, had shown nothing criminal in nature. His attentiveness reflected concern for propriety and personal interest, not malfeasance. The purchaser of the Crichton house, in contrast, exhibited a disciplined control that, while precise, allowed for small imperfections, misaligned papers, minor physical errors, that hinted at human fallibility within a framework of careful management. Purbright concluded that the town's reactions, the minor incidents, and the subtle deviations of behavior were converging toward a clearer understanding. Each layer, gossip, observation, minor anomaly, and behavioral response, contributed to a pattern that could, with patience, reveal the underlying truth without overt interrogation or coercion. The lattice of subtlety, he reflected, was often more telling than any explicit confession. Finally, as the gas lamps were lit along the cobbled streets and the last pedestrians made their way home, Purbright considered the significance of careful observation, patience, and well-timed intervention. The test had not forced disclosure, nor had it created alarm, yet it had produced insight. In Flaxborough, where civility masked curiosity and minor deviations revealed intent, the quiet orchestration of circumstances, observation of micro-behavior, and attention to social nuance were sufficient to illuminate motives that otherwise remained concealed. He extinguished the lamp, content that the day's exercise had provided both verification and subtle clarification. The patterns were emerging, faint yet discernible, and the next stages of his enquiry would proceed with this accumulated understanding, allowing the quiet unraveling of intention, the careful tracing of motive, and the disciplined observation of human behavior to guide him toward the eventual resolution. The following afternoon, Purbright arranged a quiet meeting at the town hall, choosing the long, sunlit room with high windows that cast soft patterns on the polished floor. The space was formal but familiar, lending a gentle authority without ostentation. He invited the principal figures, the purchaser of the Crichton house, Mr. Langford, and a few of the more discreet witnesses who had been involved in the minor incidents. No one knew precisely why the gathering had been called, and this uncertainty lent the proceedings a natural tension. Purbright began with small, polite remarks about the day and the town, allowing the participants to relax while carefully observing posture, glance, and tone. He spoke of the town's enduring civility and the way Flaxborough habitually monitored deviations from routine. Each phrase, seemingly innocuous, carried subtle weight. It drew attention without alarm, highlighted patterns without accusation, and invited reflection rather than confession. "I asked you all to meet," Purbright said, his tone measured and formal, "because the recent events surrounding the Crichton house have generated curiosity and, understandably, speculation. My purpose is neither to chastise nor to dramatize, but to present the situation as it appears when observed in its entirety." He paused, allowing the words to settle, observing how each person reacted. Langford's expression was composed, though the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth betrayed the awareness he had displayed during the market test. The purchaser, seated upright with careful poise, responded only with polite attentiveness, a subtle acknowledgement of observation. "Let us begin with the auction itself," Purbright continued. "The house, long empty, was purchased by a gentleman previously unknown to most of the town. The sum paid, while respectable, was not extraordinary. Yet the manner in which the transaction was conducted, precise, deliberate, and entirely controlled, has prompted speculation, not least among those whose expectations were disappointed. He allowed a small smile, lightly ironic, to temper the formality. It is a human tendency to seek simple explanations for complexity, convenient suspects to fill the gaps in understanding. In this instance, Mr. Langford, you became the natural focus, owing not to action but to circumstance and the town's inclination toward tidy narratives. Langford inclined his head politely, acknowledging the observation without protest. Purbright's phrasing was gentle yet revealing. He laid the framework for truth without force, allowing those present to recognize their own misconceptions. Purbright continued, drawing attention to the trivial yet telling incidents, the misplaced umbrella, the minor disturbance within the house, and the scattered papers. Each of these events, he said, might appear trivial or suggestive of intent, and yet when observed carefully, they reflect patterns of behavior rather than wrongdoing. Minor oversights, slight misalignments,
and deviations from expectation. These are natural, human,
and often more revealing than deliberate action. He turned toward the purchaser, speaking with a quiet civility that emphasized respect over accusation. Your management of the house, your care in arranging and inspecting, has demonstrated meticulous attention. The small misalignments we observed were neither deliberate nor consequential, beyond their capacity to illustrate methodical human behavior. Your diligence, rather than alarm, has been the source of minor disruption. Purbright then addressed the interactions between individuals. Mr. Langford's vigilance, the town's observations, and the polite reactions of bystanders have created a lattice of perception. Each participant, acting according to personal habit and understanding, has contributed to a collective misinterpretation.
magnifying ordinary actions into conjecture. He paused,
allowing silence to underscore the subtlety of the revelation. The truth, therefore, is not dramatic nor sensational. It is civil, ordinary, and entirely human. The initial alarm, the convenient suspect, and the minor incidents all formed a narrative constructed by expectation, imagination and observation, rather than malice or intent. Langford nodded, a faint relief crossing his features, while the purchaser's slight smile suggested recognition of the patient clarity with which events had been traced. Even the minor witnesses absorbed the explanation, understanding that their own embellishments, minor as they were, had contributed to an overcomplication of what was essentially ordinary behavior observed under unusual scrutiny. Purbright concluded with a reflection that encapsulated his quiet method. In Flaxborough, civility and routine are the threads by which human behavior is measured. Deviations attract attention, not always for what they reveal overtly, but for the patterns they suggest. Observation, patience, and careful reflection allow us to discern the underlying intentions without resorting to speculation or dramatic assertion. He inclined his head politely. There is no villainy here, no intrigue beyond the ordinary curiosity of townsfolk, and no consequence beyond the minor corrections and observations already noted. The Crichton house is, for now, occupied by one who will maintain it with care. The town may continue its gentle surveillance, as it always does, but the underlying truth is simple, civil, and entirely unremarkable, except, of course, for the lessons it affords those who observe closely. The room remained quiet for a moment, then soft murmurs of agreement circulated. The subtle satisfaction of recognition rather than triumph settled over the participants. Purbright, having guided them through the lattice of observation, motive, and human habit, allowed the explanation to stand, needing neither embellishment nor spectacle. By the time the meeting concluded, the air of tension had dissipated entirely, replaced by the polite composure and mild curiosity that marked Flaxborough life. Purbright, his task complete, noted with quiet approval the efficacy of subtle observation, patient inquiry, and carefully staged interaction in revealing the underlying truth without drama or force. The town's rhythms, now restored, carried with them minor adjustments in perception, enhanced awareness of human behavior, and a renewed appreciation for civility's capacity to mask and reveal in equal measure. Purbright returned to his office, satisfied that the sequence of observation, subtle testing, and calm explanation had completed the unraveling of the minor mystery, leaving only the ordinary patterns of human life to continue in their habitual, civil course. The morning after Purbright's explanation dawned clear and calm over Flaxborough, the streets glistening faintly from overnight dew. The town resumed its habitual routines, each resident moving with an air of measured normality, though beneath that calm there lingered a gentle ripple of awareness. The Crichton house, now securely occupied, seemed less a source of curiosity and more a quiet anchor for the town's imagination. Windows reflected the early sun, the garden appeared tidy in its newfound order, and the faint rustle of birdsong added a delicate overlay to the returning rhythm of civic life. Purbright, walking through the market square, observed the small but telling adjustments in behaviour. Mrs. Pilling, knitting her usual patterns, now glanced at Northgate Lane without the urgency that had characterized her recent days. The conversation among her companions was gentler, speculative but tempered by the acknowledgement that events had unfolded without scandal. Even Mr. Warbeck, usually reserved and deliberate, allowed himself a faintly amused comment on the efficiency with which minor mysteries could be unravelled with observation and patience. In the town hall, Mr. Pembroke arranged upcoming auctions with his customary meticulousness. The earlier commotion over the Crichton house seemed to have settled into a memory, with occasional private murmurs among staff regarding the careful calculation of the purchaser and the town's responses. Purbright noted the subtle approval in Pembroke's posture and expression. The events had reinforced, rather than disrupted, the town's quiet social order. Later, the inspector visited the Crichton house briefly, exchanging polite words with the occupant regarding minor adjustments and repairs. The conversation was civil and precise, reflecting a balance of discretion, mutual respect, and understated civility. No overt tension remained, only a residual attentiveness to detail, as if the events had left an invisible imprint on the way spaces and actions were managed. The occupant's slight nod, a micro-gesture of recognition for prior observation, was all the acknowledgement required for Purbright to register that his patient scrutiny had been effective without imposing undue concern. Through the afternoon, Purbright wandered the quieter streets, noting the subtle shifts in perception that followed his explanation. Citizens moved with ordinary purpose, yet glances, gestures, and interactions bore the imprint of minor awareness. A shopkeeper, who had previously exaggerated small movements into conspiratorial behavior, now greeted patrons with a gentler composure. A postman, formerly speculative, delivered mail with an understated precision, having absorbed the lessons implicit in observation without speculation. The lattice of human behavior, which had been disrupted by curiosity, minor anomaly, and subtle misinterpretation, now settled into a pattern slightly altered but fundamentally intact. The town's civility had been reinforced, tempered by the gentle lesson that observation, patience, and discretion often revealed truth more efficiently than gossip or conjecture. Flaxborough had absorbed the minor upheaval and integrated it into its social memory, adjusting perceptions and expectations in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Purbright returned to his office in the early evening, arranging papers and reviewing notes with habitual care. The sequence of observation, minor incidents, testing, and explanation had completed its cycle. The subtle alignment of actions, gestures, and reactions had revealed the interplay of human intent without spectacle or dramatic confrontation. Patterns that had seemed chaotic or contradictory now resolved into a coherent, civil understanding, illustrating the quiet mechanics of behavior, motive, and social expectation. He considered the town as a whole, the subtle shifts in posture, the moderated curiosity, the careful attention to civility, and the restrained recognition of human fallibility. Even in the absence of overt drama, the ordinary had been illuminated, revealing both the fragility and the resilience of social cohesion. Each citizen, consciously or unconsciously, had been reminded of the balance between observation and assumption, intervention and patience. By dusk, Purbright took a moment to glance from his office window at the Crichton house. Its windows glimmered with the faint reflection of the fading sun. The garden appeared orderly, the doors secure, and the subtle presence of life suggested continuity without intrusion. The town's gaze, once drawn into conjecture and minor scandal, had returned to its natural equilibrium. The subtle lessons of civility, observation, and attentiveness remained, though invisible to all but the most attentive eye. Purbright settled into his chair, the day's work concluded. The papers before him were ordinary, the streets below calm, and the air carried only the faint sounds of evening, a distant carriage, the soft footfall of a late pedestrian, the occasional whisper of wind. In this quiet, he reflected on the efficiency of subtle observation, the resilience of civility, and the capacity of a town to absorb minor disturbances without disruption. The Crichton house had served as a focal point, the minor incidents as instruments of insight, and the town's responses as a network revealing human intent in microcosm. He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The mystery, modest in scale yet intricate in its social and behavioral dimensions, had been unraveled, not through accusation, not through force, but through patient observation, subtle testing, and civil explanation. The town resumed its rhythm, enriched subtly by the events, aware of the delicate interplay of civility, observation, and human nature, though only a few could articulate what had truly been revealed. As night settled fully over Flaxborough, Purbright closed his ledger, straightened his coat, and prepared to leave the office. The streets were quiet, the houses aligned in ordinary rows, the town restored to its familiar order. In Flaxborough, life would continue, subtly informed by the day's lessons, the careful calibration of observation, and the gentle imprint of understanding that required neither spectacle nor sensationalism to endure.